A quiet day, a strange catch. Jack loved fishing. To him, it was more than just a hobby. It was a way to escape from the noise of the world. He'd always say, "The ocean has its secrets, and maybe one day it'll share them with me." On this particular day, the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow across the water. The gentle waves lapped against his small boat, and Jack leaned back, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. He had anchored near a spot the locals called the Serpent's Rest. It was a quiet cove, rumored to be cursed because of the strange happenings reported there. But Jack didn't believe in curses, just good fishing spots. With a well-practiced flick of his wrist, he cast his line into the water and waited. Minutes turned into hours. The occasional seagull cawed overhead, and the rhythmic sound of waves kept Jack company. Just as he started to think about packing up, his fishing rod jerked violently. Finally, a bite. Jack muttered, gripping the rod tightly. The pull was strong, too strong for a regular fish. His arms strained as he tried to reel it in. Whatever was on the other end was heavy, and it fought against him with surprising force. "Come on, you're not getting away that easily," Jack grunted, his muscles burning from the effort. After what felt like an eternity, the line started to slacken, and Jack finally pulled his catch to the surface. But it wasn't a fish. Instead, dangling from his hook was a glowing, pearl-like object about the size of a grapefruit. It shimmered with an iridescent light, its surface smooth yet strangely warm to the touch. Jack stared at it, baffled. "What in the world?" he whispered, lifting the strange find out of the water. The glow seemed to pulse, as if the object were alive. He turned it over in his hands, unable to make sense of it. Suddenly, the water around his boat began to ripple unnaturally. The once calm waves turned choppy, and the air grew heavy, as if the ocean itself were holding its breath. Jack's heart pounded. He glanced around, trying to spot the cause of the disturbance. Then, without warning, a figure broke the surface of the water. It wasn't a diver or a swimmer. It was something else entirely. A woman emerged, her skin a soft, pearly hue that seemed to glow faintly in the fading sunlight. Her hair flowed like seaweed, dark and shimmering with streaks of silver. But what caught Jack's attention most were her eyes, large, luminous, and the color of a stormy sky. "Human," she said, her voice carrying an otherworldly melody that sent shivers down Jack's spine. "Why are you in our waters?" Jack was too stunned to speak. He blinked, half convinced he was dreaming. The woman's gaze shifted to the glowing pearl in his hands, and her expression hardened. "That does not belong to you," she said firmly, pointing to the object. Jack finally found his voice. I didn't mean to take anything. It was just on my line, I swear." The woman tilted her head, studying him as though weighing his words. The water around her seemed to shimmer, and Jack realized she wasn't alone. More figures began to rise from the waves, their forms cloaked in the same radiant glow. They surrounded his boat, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his stomach churn. "Listen, I don't want any trouble," Jack said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "If this is yours, you can have it back." The woman reached out, her hand brushing against the pearl. The glow intensified, and for a brief moment, Jack felt a strange warmth spread through him, as if the object recognized her touch. She took a step closer, her expression softening slightly. "I am Naelira," she said, her voice calmer now, but still commanding. "This is a sacred artifact of my people, and its presence here is no accident. You have trespassed into waters that are not meant for humans." "Trespassed," Jack echoed, his pulse quickening. "I didn't know. I was just fishing." Naelira narrowed her eyes, but there was no malice in her gaze, only curiosity. "Perhaps it is fate, then, that brought you here," she murmured, almost to herself. Before Jack could respond, the glowing figures surrounding his boat began to hum, their voices creating a hauntingly beautiful harmony that seemed to vibrate through the air. Naelira raised her hand, silencing them. "You must come with me," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Come with you." "Where?" Jack asked, his voice rising with panic. "I can't just leave my boat." Naelira's lips curved into a faint smile. "Your boat will be safe. But you, human, you have much to answer for." Before Jack could protest further, the water around his boat began to rise, forming a shimmering bubble that enveloped him completely. He barely had time to take a breath before the bubble pulled him down, plunging him into the depths of the ocean. As the light of the surface faded above him, Jack's mind raced with questions. Who was Naelira? What was this glowing pearl? And most importantly, what had he just gotten himself into? The hidden kingdom. Jack's mind raced as the shimmering figures surrounded his small boat. The air felt heavier with each passing second, and the rhythmic hum emanating from the figures was both hypnotic and unsettling. Naelira, the mysterious woman with glowing scales and piercing eyes, gestured toward the glowing pearl still clutched in his hand. "You don't understand what you've touched, human," she said, her voice carrying an unearthly melody. "This artifact belongs to my people. You've disrupted its slumber." "I didn't mean to," Jack exclaimed, his voice cracking. "I swear, I was just fishing." Naelira studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, Jack thought he saw something other than anger in her gaze, curiosity, perhaps, or even concern. Before he could say more, she raised her hand. The figures around the boat moved in unison, their glowing forms blending with the water. Jack barely had time to gasp before the water surged upward, surrounding him in a liquid cocoon. "Wait, what are you doing?" Jack shouted, his voice muffled by the water. Panic gripped him as he realized the bubble surrounding him was pulling him down. But as the fear took hold, he noticed something strange. He could still breathe. The water didn't choke him. Instead, it felt as if the bubble created a protective shield, allowing him to inhale normally. The descent was swift. Jack's boat vanished above, replaced by a kaleidoscope of colors as they plunged into the depths. Bioluminescent creatures darted past, their glowing bodies leaving trails of light in the dark water. The sight was breathtaking, but Jack couldn't focus on the beauty. He was too preoccupied with the growing pressure in his chest, the fear of the unknown. "Where are you taking me?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "To my home," Naelira replied, her tone calm but firm. "You need to understand the gravity of what you've done." Jack wanted to protest, but the words stuck in his throat as the underwater world came into view. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. Then, the towering structures became clear, giant coral spires that glowed with hues of green, blue, and gold. The city spread out like a vast underwater metropolis, with shimmering bridges and pathways connecting the towering structures. Schools of glowing fish swam lazily around the buildings, while strange sea creatures hovered in the open spaces. This is incredible," Jack whispered, his awe temporarily overpowering his fear. The bubble carried him through an archway into a grand plaza. The ground beneath him was made of a smooth, translucent material that reflected the glow of the city. Dozens of figures similar to Naelira gathered, their curious eyes fixed on Jack. He felt like an exhibit in a strange, otherworldly zoo. "Silence," Naelira commanded, and the murmurs of the crowd ceased. She turned to Jack, her expression unreadable. "You are standing in the heart of my kingdom. Do not mistake our kindness for weakness." Before Jack could respond, a booming voice echoed through the chamber. "Naelira, what is the meaning of this?" Jack turned to see a regal figure approaching. A man with similar glowing scales, but an aura of authority that made Jack instinctively straighten. He wore an ornate mantle that shimmered like liquid gold, and his piercing gaze fixed on Naelira. "Father," Naelira said, bowing slightly. "This human stumbled upon the pearl of radiance. I believe he may be important." The man, whom Jack assumed was the king, raised an eyebrow. "Important? He is a surface dweller. They do not belong here." "I would agree," Naelira replied, her tone measured. But the pearl responded to him. The crowd murmured again, and Jack shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't mean to find it," he said, addressing the king. "It just ended up on my fishing line. If it's yours, you can have it back." The king's eyes narrowed. "The pearl is no ordinary object. It is a relic of great power, tied to the balance of our world. If it ended up in your hands, it is no coincidence." Jack didn't know how to respond. He looked at Naelira, hoping for some kind of guidance. Her expression softened slightly, and she stepped closer to him. "You may not realize it, human," she said, "but your actions have set a chain of events into motion. The pearl's awakening has stirred forces that have lain dormant for centuries. We must act quickly to prevent disaster." "What kind of disaster?" Jack asked, his voice shaking. Naelira hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "The Leviathans," she finally said. "Ancient beings that once ruled these waters. The pearl's energy keeps them at bay, but now that it's been disturbed." Jack swallowed hard. "You think they'll come back?" "They will," Naelira said grimly. "And if they do, not just our kingdom, but your world, too, will suffer." The king stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "You brought this upon us, human. You will help fix it." Jack opened his mouth to protest, but stopped when he saw the pleading look in Naelira's eyes. He felt a strange pull. Something about her made him want to help, even if it meant risking his own safety. "What do I have to do?" he asked, the words escaping before he could second-guess himself. Naelira's expression softened, and for the first time, Jack thought he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Come with me. There's another artifact we must retrieve, a relic tied to the pearl. It's the only way to restore balance." As the crowd watched in silence, Jack nodded reluctantly. "All right," he said. "I'll help." The king's expression didn't soften, but he gave a curt nod. "Then let us hope you are as brave as you are foolish, surface dweller." With that, Jack's journey into the unknown truly began. A royal proposition. Jack found himself seated in an extraordinary chamber that seemed to pulsate with life. The walls were made of coral that glowed softly, casting the room in hues of green and gold. Bioluminescent plants hung from the ceiling, their tendrils swaying gently in an unseen current. The air was cool, tinged with a faint, salty breeze, but the atmosphere was far from calming. Jack's heart pounded as he tried to process everything he had seen and heard in the last few hours. Across from him, Naelira stood tall, her iridescent scales catching the glow of the room's natural light. Her gaze was intense, piercing through Jack as if she could see into the depths of his soul. The glowing pearl he had accidentally fished from the ocean rested on a pedestal between them, pulsating faintly as if alive. Its rhythmic glow mirrored the unsteady thudding of Jack's heartbeat. "You don't understand what you've done, human," Naelira began, her voice calm but firm. "That pearl is more than just a relic. It is the lifeblood of my people." Jack frowned, his confusion evident. "I told you, I didn't mean to take it. It just ended up on my line." "If it's so important, why was it out there in the first place?" Naelira sighed, her expression softening slightly. She began to pace, her movements fluid and deliberate, like a predator stalking prey. "The Pearl of Radiance was lost decades ago during a great storm. It fell into forbidden waters, a place even we dare not enter. For years, we believed it was gone forever. And with it, the balance of our kingdom." "Balance?" Jack asked, leaning forward slightly. "What kind of balance?" Naelira stopped pacing and fixed her stormy blue eyes on him. "The pearl's energy is tied to the protection of our kingdom. It keeps the Leviathans, the ancient rulers of these waters, dormant. Without it, their power will grow, and they will awaken." The room seemed to grow colder as she spoke, and Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't know what these Leviathans were, but the way Naelira spoke of them made his blood run cold. "So, what do you want from me?" Jack asked cautiously. "I mean, I'm just a fisherman. I don't know anything about ancient pearls or leviathans." Naelira stepped closer, her tone softening. "Perhaps not, but fate brought you to that pearl. It responded to your touch, Jack. That is no accident. The bond you share with it may be the key to restoring its power." Jack shook his head, disbelief etched on his face. "You think this pearl chose me? That's insane." "Call it what you will," Naelira said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But the pearl's glow brightened when you held it. That has never happened with any of my people. You are connected to it in a way we do not yet understand." Jack opened his mouth to argue but stopped. Deep down, he felt something. A strange warmth when he held the pearl, as if it recognized him. It was a feeling he couldn't explain, but it nagged at him nonetheless. "So, what do you want me to do?" he asked finally, his tone resigned. Naelira's expression turned serious again. "The pearl is only one part of the puzzle. To fully restore balance, we need to find the trident of tides, a relic that amplifies the pearl's power. It lies in the abyssal ruins, deep within the forbidden waters." Jack blinked, the name alone sending a chill down his spine. Abyssal ruins. That doesn't sound like a friendly place. "It isn't," Naelira admitted. "The ruins are guarded by traps and creatures far more dangerous than anything you've encountered. But it's our only hope. Without the trident, the leviathans will rise, and not just my kingdom but your world, too, will face their wrath." Jack leaned back in his seat, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't a hero or an adventurer, just a guy who wanted to catch some fish and enjoy a quiet life. But now he was being asked to risk everything for a kingdom he didn't even belong to. "Why me?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you're the only one who can," Naelira said simply. "The pearl chose you, and now so must I." Jack looked at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. For the first time, he saw her not as a commanding, otherworldly figure, but as someone burdened by responsibility. Her people's survival rested on her shoulders, and she was willing to trust a complete stranger to help her carry that weight. He sighed, shaking his head. "All right," he said finally. "I'll do it. I'll help you find this trident." Naelira's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Jack. You have no idea how much this means to me. To all of us." Jack glanced at the pearl, its glow steady and calm now. He didn't know what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: there was no turning back. As Naelira began to explain the journey ahead, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far greater than he could have ever imagined. The first test. The ocean stretched endlessly around them, dark and foreboding, as Jack and Naelira prepared to descend into the abyssal trench. The glow of the hidden kingdom faded behind them, and the silence of the deep became suffocating. Jack clutched the breathing device Naelira had given him, a small glowing pendant that wrapped a thin layer of breathable water around his face. It felt unnatural, but he forced himself to trust her. "You don't have to do this," Naelira said, her voice softer than usual. She floated beside him, her scaled armor shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her trident, different from the relic they sought, was strapped to her back, and her expression carried a weight of concern. Jack chuckled nervously, trying to mask his fear. "What's the alternative? Let your Leviathan friends wake up and turn the world into an all-you-can-eat buffet." Naelira smirked but said nothing. She gestured ahead to the trench below, a jagged scar in the ocean floor that seemed to swallow the light. "Stay close. The trench has guardians." "Guardians?" Jack asked, his voice rising with unease. "What kind of guardians?" "The kind that don't ask questions before they attack," she replied, already swooning ahead. "Keep your wits about you." Jack hesitated, staring into the dark chasm below. He wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the idea of facing the unknown or the possibility of letting Naelira go alone. Gritting his teeth, he followed her, his legs kicking awkwardly as he adjusted to the breathing device. The water grew colder as they descended, and the light dimmed until their surroundings were bathed in an eerie bluish glow. Strange, bioluminescent creatures darted past, some small and harmless, others larger and more menacing, their glowing bodies highlighting sharp teeth and predatory eyes. Jack couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. "How far down is this thing?" he asked, his voice muffled slightly by the bubble around his face. "Far enough," Naelira replied. "The abyssal ruins are hidden for a reason. The deeper we go, the closer we get to where the Leviathans once roamed." "Great," Jack muttered. "Exactly the kind of tourist spot I'd recommend." Naelira didn't respond, her focus shifting as she slowed her pace. Jack followed her gaze and froze. Ahead of them, the water shimmered with an unnatural light, forming a massive, swirling barrier. Beyond it, the ruins came into view, towering spires of black stone covered in glowing runes. The sight was breathtaking, but it was what surrounded the ruins that made Jack's stomach drop. Guarding the entrance were massive creatures resembling eels, their bodies coiled around the ruins like living fortresses. Their eyes glowed a sickly green, and their fanged mouths snapped at anything that moved. Their presence radiated menace, and Jack felt his breath catch in his throat. "Those are the Guardians," he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes," Naelira said, her voice tense. "The abyssal worms. They've been here since before my people existed, protecting the ruins from intruders." "Fantastic," Jack muttered. "And how do we get past them? Do we ask nicely?" Naelira's lips twitched in a faint smile, but her expression quickly turned serious. "The pearl you carry, it's the key to the ruins. Its energy can pacify the worms, but only for a short time." Jack's eyes widened. "Pacify them? That's your plan?" "Unless you have a better one," Naelira said, turning to face him. "This is where I need you, Jack. The pearl chose you for a reason. Its power will respond to you." Jack looked at the glowing orb strapped to his chest, its light pulsing faintly. He hadn't felt particularly chosen by anything. It was more like he had been dragged into a nightmare. But the determination in Naelira's eyes left him no room to argue. "All right," he said, taking a deep breath. "Tell me what to do." Naelira nodded. "Hold the pearl and focus on the ruins. Visualize the path we need to take." "That's it. Just think really hard," Jack asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's not as simple as it sounds," she replied. "The pearl will amplify your intent, but you have to stay focused. If you waver, the worms will sense it." Jack swallowed hard, his palms sweating despite the cold. He reached for the pearl, its warmth surprising against his skin. Closing his eyes, he tried to visualize the ruins as clearly as possible. The spires, the glowing rooms, the path that wound through the entrance. He focused on the idea of peace, willing the Guardians to let them pass. The pearl's glow intensified, and Jack felt a strange energy coursing through him. It was as if the artifact were alive, responding to his thoughts. The water around them shimmered, and the worms stirred, their glowing eyes locking onto Jack. For a moment, he thought they were about to attack. But then, the nearest worm let out a deep, rumbling growl and uncoiled slightly, creating a narrow path. The others followed suit, their massive bodies shifting just enough to allow passage. "It's working," Naelira whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Keep going, Jack." Jack opened his eyes, surprised to see the path clear. He exhaled shakily, his legs weak from the effort. "That was so bad." Naelira smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did well. But this is only the beginning." They swam forward, the ruins towering above them like ancient sentinels. As they crossed the threshold, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows. The ruins were beautiful, but they carried an unmistakable sense of danger. Jack glanced at Naelira. "What's next?" Her expression darkened. "The trials of the ruins. And if the stories are true, they will test more than just your courage." Jack sighed, muttering to himself, "Great, just great." As they ventured deeper into the ruins, Jack realized he was in over his head. But there was no turning back now. The first test was behind them, and whatever lay ahead would demand even more. Secrets of the deep. The abyssal ruins loomed around Jack and Naelira, the towering spires casting long, dark shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly in the faint, blue-tinged light. The glowing runes on the walls pulsed faintly, as though responding to their presence. The eerie silence was broken only by the distant, echoing sounds of the ocean's movements, a constant reminder of just how deep they had ventured. Jack felt a knot in his stomach as they entered a large chamber. The walls were adorned with intricate carvings of sea creatures, many of which he didn't recognize. Some depicted battles between colossal beings, others showed moments of harmony, images of a time when the ocean's balance was intact. "What is this place?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness. "This is the Hall of Memories," Naelira said softly, her gaze sweeping over the carvings. "It tells the story of my people and the Leviathans. These walls are ancient, older than our kingdom itself." Jack moved closer to one of the carvings. It showed a massive creature, an unmistakable Leviathan, coiled around a glowing sphere that looked eerily similar to the pearl he carried. Smaller figures surrounded it, bowing in reverence. "The Leviathans, they weren't always monsters, were they?" he asked. Naelira shook her head. "No. Long ago, they were protectors of the ocean, revered for their power and wisdom. But something changed. Greed, pride, perhaps even betrayal. We don't know. They turned on us, and their rage nearly destroyed everything." Jack's eyes lingered on the carving. He could almost feel the weight of the history it depicted. "And now they're waking up," he said grimly. "Yes," Naelira said, her tone heavy with sadness. "But the pearl and the trident of tides can restore the balance they once maintained." Jack glanced at her, noticing the way her voice wavered. "You don't sound convinced." Naelira hesitated, her gaze fixed on the carving. "The legends speak of trials within these ruins. They are said to test not just strength, but also heart, mind, and soul. Many have tried to retrieve the trident, and all have failed." Jack felt his chest tighten. "And you thought now was the right time to tell me this?" Naelira's lips curved into a faint smile. "Would you have come if I had told you earlier?" Jack sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "Fair point." As they moved deeper into the ruins, the air seemed to grow heavier, pressing against Jack's chest. The glowing runes on the walls brightened, casting strange shadows that seemed to flicker and dance. Ahead, the path split into 3 tunnels, each one dark and foreboding. Naelira stopped, her brow furrowing. "This is it, the first trial." Jack frowned. 3 tunnels. "Let me guess. One of them leads to the trident, and the others lead to something worse." Naelira nodded. "Each path presents a challenge. Choose wisely, Jack." Jack stared at the tunnels, his heart pounding. "Me? Why do I have to choose?" "Because the pearl responds to you," Naelira said simply. "It will guide you, if you trust it." Jack looked down at the pearl hanging from his neck. Its glow seemed to pulse faintly, as if it were alive. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, focusing on the warmth of the artifact. Slowly, he felt a pull, a faint sensation that drew him toward the middle tunnel. "This one," he said, pointing. Naelira nodded. "Then we follow." The tunnel was narrow, its walls damp and cold. Strange whispers echoed around them, though there was no one else in sight. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced at Naelira, but her focus was unshaken, her hand resting on the trident strapped to her back. After what felt like hours, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. In the center stood a pedestal, and atop it rested a smaller glowing artifact, a fragment of the trident. "That's it," Naelira whispered. "The first piece." Jack stepped forward cautiously, but the moment his foot touched the chamber floor, the runes on the walls flared to life. A low rumble filled the room, and the shadows coalesced into a massive, serpent-like figure with glowing eyes. The creature hissed, its voice echoing in Jack's mind. Who dares disturb the sacred relic? Jack froze, his throat dry. Just passing through. The serpent's glowing eyes narrowed. Only those of pure heart may claim the relic. Prove your worth, or perish. Naelira stepped forward, her trident raised. Wait, Jack said, stopping her. It said I had to prove myself. Naelira hesitated, then nodded. Be careful, Jack. The serpent lunged, but not with its body. It attacked Jack's mind. He staggered as visions flooded his thoughts. Memories of failure, guilt, and fear. He saw his parents' disappointed faces when he dropped out of college, the look of betrayal on his best friend's face after an argument, and the many times he'd chosen the easy path over the right one. You are unworthy, the serpent's voice echoed. Your heart is filled with doubt. Jack clenched his fists, his breathing ragged. Maybe it is, he muttered. But I'm here, aren't I? I'm trying. The serpent paused, its glowing eyes studying him. Trying is not enough. Prove your resolve. Jack reached for the pearl, its warmth grounding him. I don't know if I'm pure of heart or whatever you're looking for, he said, his voice steadying. But I'm not leaving without that relic. The serpent let out a deafening roar, then lunged again. This time, Jack didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward the pedestal. The pearl's glow intensified, and the serpent froze mid-strike, its form dissolving into light. When the light faded, the room was still. Jack stood before the pedestal, the fragment of the trident glowing softly in his hand. He turned to Naelira, his chest heaving. Was that pure enough for you? He asked, managing the shaky grin. Naelira's lips curved into a smile. It was more than enough. As they prepared to move on, Jack couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride. The first trial was over, but the journey was far from finished. Trust and sacrifice. The weight of the trident fragment hung heavy in Jack's hand as he and Naelira swam through the winding corridors of the ruins. The glow of the fragment illuminated the path ahead, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Jack's heart still raced from the trial they had just overcome, but there was no time to rest. The ruins seemed alive, their ancient energies shifting and pulsing as if aware of their presence. How many more trials are there? Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 2, Naelira replied, her tone grim. Each one more dangerous than the last. The ruins are designed to test every part of you, your will, your courage, and, ultimately, your loyalty. Jack raised an eyebrow. Loyalty to what? To balance, Naelira said, her gaze fixed ahead. To the world. To those who depend on you. The ruins don't just test individuals. They test the bond between those who enter. Jack frowned. And what happens if we fail? Naelira stopped and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Failure isn't an option, Jack. If we fail, the Leviathans will rise, and everything, my kingdom, your world, will be consumed. The weight of her words settled on Jack's shoulders, heavier than the fragment he carried. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Then we won't fail. They pressed on, the path narrowing as they descended deeper into the ruins. The water grew colder, and the glow of the trident fragment flickered, as though warning them of what lay ahead. Suddenly, the tunnel widened into another chamber. This one was starkly different from the Hall of Memories. It was vast and empty, with a swirling vortex of dark water at its center. Naelira's expression tightened. The second trial. Jack stared at the vortex, unease prickling at the back of his neck. What is it? Naelira hesitated. It's called the Abyssal Mirror. It reflects your darkest fears, your deepest regrets. If you cannot face what it shows you, it will consume you. Jack exhaled sharply, his pulse quickening. Fantastic. Another funhouse of horrors. Naelira gave him a faint smile. Stay close. The mirror can separate us, make us see things that aren't real. Trust what you know, not what you see. Jack nodded, gripping the fragment tightly as they stepped closer to the vortex. The moment they crossed its threshold, the water shifted around them, growing thick and heavy. The chamber dissolved, replaced by a scene that made Jack's stomach drop. He was back on his fishing boat, but this time it was sinking. The water around him churned violently, and the skies above were dark and stormy. He could hear voices, familiar ones, his father's, stern and disappointed, his best friend's, hurt and angry. They echoed in his mind, drowning out his thoughts. "You're nothing but a failure, Jack," his father's voice boomed. "Always taking the easy way out. Why didn't you help me?" His friend's voice cut through, raw with emotion. "You could have been there, but you didn't even try." Jack shook his head, clenching his fists. "This isn't real," he muttered. "None of this is real." The scene shifted again. Now he was standing on a crumbling bridge, Naelira on the other side. The trident fragment glowed faintly in his hand, but the path between them was breaking apart. Below, the dark waters swirled ominously, filled with shadowy figures reaching for him. "Jack," Naelira called, her voice filled with urgency. "You have to jump." Jack hesitated, his fear paralyzing him. The gap between them was wide, the fall deadly. He could hear the voices again, louder now, mocking him, telling him he'd never make it. "Jack." Naelira's voice broke through the noise. "Trust me." He looked at her, her outstretched hand glowing faintly in the dark. Something in her eyes steadied him, a quiet determination that cut through his fear. Taking a deep breath, he ran forward and leaped. For a moment, he felt weightless, the dark waters below pulling at him. Then his hand found hers, and she pulled him to safety. The scene dissolved, the vortex fading as the chamber returned to view. "You did it," Naelira said, her voice soft with relief. Jack exhaled, his heart pounding. "Barely." She smiled, squeezing his hand briefly before stepping forward. In the center of the chamber, another fragment of the trident appeared, glowing brightly. Naelira retrieved it and handed it to Jack. "This was your trial as much as it was mine," she said. "You faced your fears and overcame them. That's what matters." Jack looked at the fragments in his hands, their light stronger now that they were together. "What's next?" Naelira's expression grew serious. "The final trial. It will require everything we have, Jack. But together, I believe we can succeed." Jack nodded, a new resolve hardening in his chest. The trials were testing him in ways he never thought possible, but he wasn't alone. With Naelira by his side, he felt a flicker of hope. They would face whatever came next, and they would not fail. A royal connection. The final chamber was unlike anything Jack had ever seen. Massive columns of glowing coral rose from the ocean floor, their surfaces covered in ancient carvings that seemed to shift and shimmer as he moved. The water here was unnaturally still, heavy with a sense of anticipation. At the center of the chamber stood the Trident of Tides, a magnificent weapon glowing with radiant energy, its 3 prongs piercing the ground like a beacon of power. Jack and Naelira stood at the edge of the chamber, their breaths shallow. The 2 fragments Jack carried hummed softly, resonating with the energy of the trident. The sound was almost soothing, but the atmosphere in the chamber was anything but. "This is it," Naelira said, her voice steady but quiet. "The trident." Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the relic. "Looks easy enough to grab." Naelira gave him a wry smile. "If it were easy, it wouldn't still be here." The moment they stepped into the chamber, the water began to stir. The coral columns lit up, and a deep guttural rumble echoed through the space. Jack felt the vibration in his chest, like the growl of some ancient beast awakening from its slumber. "I'm guessing that's not a welcome mat," Jack muttered, gripping the fragments tightly. Naelira's expression hardened. "The final guardian. Stay close to me." The water in front of the trident began to twist and churn, forming a massive whirlpool. From its depths emerged a colossal creature, its form both beautiful and terrifying. It was serpentine, with shimmering scales that reflected every color of the ocean. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its jaws were lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth. It moved with a grace that belied its massive size, coiling around the trident like a living fortress. "That's a leviathan," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. Naelira nodded, her grip tightening on her own trident. "Not just any leviathan. This is Sereth, the sentinel, the last line of defense for the trident." Jack swallowed hard. "And how exactly do we get past it?" Naelira glanced at him, her expression softening. "The trident fragments you hold, they're the key. Together, we must channel their power and awaken the trident. It's the only way to defeat Sereth." Jack stared at the glowing fragments in his hands. "Awaken it? How do I even do that?" "Focus," Naelira said. "The fragments will guide you, just as the pearl did. But you have to trust yourself, and me." Jack nodded, taking a deep breath. "All right, let's do this." As they approached the leviathan, Sereth let out a deafening roar, the sound shaking the chamber. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto Jack, and it lunged. Naelira reacted instantly, darting in front of him and raising her trident. A barrier of light erupted between them, halting the leviathan's attack. "Now, Jack," Naelira shouted. "Focus on the trident." Jack closed his eyes, clutching the fragments tightly. He felt their warmth spreading through his body, a steady pulse that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. The fragments seemed to hum in unison, their energy growing stronger with each passing second. Slowly, he extended his hands toward the trident. The trident responded. Its glow intensified, filling the chamber with blinding light. Jack felt a surge of energy coursing through him, like the ocean itself was flowing through his veins. He opened his eyes and saw the fragments leave his hands, fusing with the trident in a burst of light. The leviathan roared again, but this time its movements faltered. The trident's energy enveloped it, binding it in glowing chains. Sereth thrashed against the restraints, but they held firm. Naelira stepped forward, her voice firm and commanding. "Sereth, sentinel of the abyss, your time as guardian has ended. Return to your slumber." The leviathan let out one final roar before its form dissolved into light, sinking back into the whirlpool. The chamber fell silent, the stillness almost deafening. Jack collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving. We did it," he said, his voice shaky. Naelira knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, Jack. The trident awakened because of you." He looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Couldn't have done it without you." Naelira returned the smile, her expression softening. "You've proven yourself in ways no one expected. Not just to me, but to the ruins, to the ocean itself. You're more than just a fisherman, Jack." Jack laughed weakly. "Still feel like one." She helped him to his feet, and together they approached the trident. Its glow had dimmed slightly, but its presence was still powerful. Naelira placed a hand on it, her expression one of reverence. "With this, the balance will be restored," she said. "The leviathans will remain dormant, and my kingdom will be safe." Jack looked at her, a question lingering in his mind. "And what about me?" Naelira turned to him, her gaze soft. "The choice is yours, Jack. You've earned your place in my kingdom, if you wish to stay. But if your heart calls you back to your world, I will not stop you." Jack hesitated, his mind racing. The ocean had shown him wonders he never thought possible, and Naelira had become someone he couldn't imagine leaving behind. But the thought of home tugged at him too. After a moment, he smiled. "I think I'll stick around. Someone's got to keep an eye on these tridents and leviathans." Naelira laughed, the sound light and musical. "I'm glad to hear that." Together, they lifted the trident and began their journey back to the kingdom, the weight of their success mingling with the promise of a new beginning. The trials were over, But their story was just beginning.